gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, another question from Dr. Robert M. Price. He's picking on you. Is the parable of the wicked tenants based on the Odyssey episode of Penelope's suitors?
Yes, but it's also related to the parable of the Great Supper in the Q document. So here's an example of eclectic mimesis, that Mark creates this story, and I'll walk through the story and how it has Odyssean traits. But it's also similar to the story that appears in Matthew and Luke of the Great Supper. And Matthew and Luke both have both parables. They have the parable of the Great Supper and the wicked tenants. And Matthew has them back to back, and so does the Gospel of Thomas. So the ancients saw similarities between the stories. In the famous parable of the Great Supper, a man makes a supper. He invites his friends to come to dinner. When the dinner is ready, he sends out a single servant and has him say, the dinner is ready. Each one makes an excuse, and more or less they're legitimate excuses, a business excuse, a marriage excuse, and so on. But the householder is furious. So he tells the servant, go out and call people that they may be in my house. And so in the end, the house is full. This is Q's way of talking about God's invitation to Israel to come to the banquet, metaphorical of the kingdom of God or something like that. And people make excuses, they're just too busy. And so he tells the servant, namely Jesus, to go out and invite people to come in, and that includes potentially Gentiles or sinners or whatever. It's very consistent with the social identity of the Q document. So what happens in Mark? A man builds a vineyard and builds a tower and lets it out to hired hands. And he doesn't stay there like the other fellow who created the meal. He goes on a journey. And the tenants, so he sends a servant to get the produce from the vineyard, and he gets beaten up. So the man, still in a distance, sends another servant, and he gets beat up. And then he says, well, I'll send my son, maybe they'll respect him. And he's called a beloved son. And they kill him. So Jesus in the parable says, so what is the householder going to do when he comes? He's going to come and kill those vineyard owners, and he's going to give the vineyard to others. So this can be understood as an allegory of the rejection of Israel for having killed the prophets, and Jesus coming back in thunder and giving the vineyard to Gentiles or something like that, because Mark is interested in it. So you can see the similarities to the parable of the Great Supper. Now I'm going to tell you another story. Odysseus builds a orchard with his father, and he builds his own house. And then he goes off to fight in Troy, and he's gone for 20 years. Now, when he left his servants in charge of his estate. And one of them, Melanthius, turns coat, and he's with the suitors. Now, the suitors want to kill Telemachus because he's the beloved son, And they say, if we kill him, the inheritance will be ours. Whoopee! That's exactly what happens in the parable. The tenants say, this is the son. If we kill him, we'll have the inheritance. Now, that's not the way the law works. That if you're a murderer of a son, that you inherit. And I know John Kloppenborg has tried to make sense of it. I just don't buy it. So what happens when Odysseus returns? He kills the suitors, and he restores his property to his son and to the faithful slaves, and he punishes the others. Now, this is a case of mimetic eclecticism, that Mark simultaneously is transvaluing the story in the Lost Gospel Q, and that's how you have all these parallels between the two, which scholars recognize, and that Matthew and the author of the Gospel of Thomas apparently recognize, because they put them back together, back to back. But he also imitates the Odyssey. And why does he do so? He thinks, I think, in the Q document, that Jesus did not punish those who didn't come to the vineyard sufficiently. And Mark is writing after the Jewish war and thinks the Jewish war was punishment for the death of Jesus by those who didn't accept his message. Mm-hmm. So now you have this social identity difference between the two that explains why Mark wants to be so vicious with his opponents. And when Matthew retells Mark's story of the wicked tenants, he makes it even worse. This is a king that gives a banquet for his son, and what does the master do when he comes? He kills those people and burns their city. You think that might have to do with the destruction of Jerusalem? So you have this wonderful mimetic chain going from the Q document to Mark, and Mark to Matthew, Luke, and Thomas, which is really quite sensational.
So wrapping up in Homer, I love the stories. For people who don't know this narrative, you started to tell us, but didn't really finish the narrative, right? We know the temple's destruction clearly, 70 AD. Most people watching this are Bible fans, and they're like, duh, we know what that happened. We know what happened. But you said he and his father had some vineyards, right? So there's a key connection, just knowing, okay, vineyards are playing a role. And I remember when when Odysseus comes back from the war, he reveals himself to his father in the vineyard. He goes out to the vineyard and he sees his dad, and he's like, it's me. But don't tell anyone. Shh. So this gets into the whole hush-hush thing about Jesus that I think is interesting in the Gospels that you point out. But then there's the suitors at home who want to kill his son. You started getting there, but you didn't go into the conclusion of what happens. So tell us what happens. Are they killed? Tell us what happens.
Okay, the suitors think that Odysseus has died at sea, and they're aware that Penelope is putting off marrying one of them by weaving the shroud of Laertes. And they want her to marry one of them so they can split up the loot. And Telemachus is getting in the way, and so they'd like to kill him outside the city in order that they can get the inheritance. So Telemachus is able to avoid death because of one of the more generous suitors. He says, no, this isn't a good idea, let's not do it. Odysseus comes home in disguise, disguised as a beggar, and he mills around the suitors to find out how guilty they really are. And then he reveals his identity to Eumaeus and Phlodius, his faithful servants, and he and Telemachus and these two faithful servants arm themselves, bar the doors, and kill all of the suitors, so that no longer do they have to worry about their estate being taken by these murderers. Well, the parallels to the parable are pretty interesting. The vineyard owners say, this is the heir, let's kill him so the vineyard will be ours. What's the master to do? He's going to come back and kill them and give the vineyard to others. And the parables really, the parallels, once you see them, are virtually undeniable.
Thank you.